Our gospel lesson for this morning is the first 45 verses of chapter 11 from John's Gospel. Those of you wishing to follow along will find it on page 104 in your Pew Bible. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and had wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus. Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going to go there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but he was still at that place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here so that they may believe that you have sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, had seen what Jesus did and believed in him. The word of the Lord.
As I've shared with you all before, in the fall of 2015, as news of the presidential election started to ramp up and become more rancorous, I decided to replace listening to the news while driving in my car with listening to audiobooks. I've continued this practice even after the presidential election and have worked my way through Jane Austen's corpus, many of Dickens' novels, Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time series, and a variety of other books. Getting into the spirit of Russian news, more recently I decided to listen to some Russian authors and found myself completely engrossed in 19th century St. Petersburg, as depicted by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky through Anna Karenina and Crime and Punishment. I heartily commend both novels to you if you haven't read them. I was sad when Anna Karenina ended, not only because, spoiler alert, at the end she dies, but also because I found myself longing to hear more about the world of intricate relationships and propriety that Tolstoy opens up for the reader in that novel. But it's Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment that relates to the scripture passage that Michael just read to us from John's Gospel, not Anna Karenina. So if you've read Crime and Punishment, recall your college comparative literature course or your Russian literature course. And if you're like me and took neither of those courses and didn't read these novels in college because you were a political science major or some other such major, then hang in there. We will discover together how Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment helps to open up and reveal in fresh ways this story of the raising of Lazarus and what it means for us today, when the one who is the resurrection and the life says, unbind him. So I'm just curious, how many, has anyone read Crime and Punishment? A few of us? Many of us. Okay, good. And seriously, if you haven't, stay with me. So Crime and Punishment revolves around the main character, Raskolnikov, who is literally an axe murderer. Raskolnikov robs and brutally murders an old woman, a pawnbroker, with an axe, as well as the pawnbroker's sister, Lizaveta, who happened to return home while he was in the act of murdering her sister. Much of the novel deals with Raskolnikov's anxiety, guilt, self-loathing, self-doubting, and self-justification over the brutal double murder no one else knows that he, Raskolnikov, committed. Raskolnikov befriends an acquaintance's daughter named Sonya after the acquaintance's sudden death. And on the eve of this acquaintance's funeral, Raskolnikov decides to visit Sonya, the eldest daughter of an impoverished family, and now much more so with her father's sudden death. She finds that she has no other recourse than to try to help cover family expenses through prostitution. So Sonya lives in this squalid little attic with no possessions of her own except a Bible. And the Bible was given to her by Lizaveta, who Raskolnikov discovers on this visit was Sonya's friend. Sonya has no idea that Raskolnikov is the murderer of her dear friend. And throughout most of the novel, Raskolnikov is agitated and anxious and brooding and nervous and torn. And this is the state that he's in on the night of this visit to Sonya in her little attic room. She's scared and she's nervous. And when she finds this madman there on this particular evening, it's late. She's not expecting him. It's the eve of her father's funeral. She doesn't know him that well. So Raskolnikov sort of forces his way into her room. And then when he sees the Bible on the table, he irritably demands Sonya read the story that we heard this morning of the raising of Lazarus. He's not religious, but she is. She is so terrified, she can hardly get the words out once her trembling fingers finally turn to the fourth gospel. And as she begins to read the story that we just heard read from John's gospel, her voice gets more and more confident with each verse. She sits up straighter as she reads, and when she comes to Martha's confession of faith, she claims it as her own. Dostoevsky writes, and drawing a painful breath, Sonya reads distinctly and forcibly as though she were making a public confession of faith. When she finishes the passage, concluding, unbind him and let him go, she read loudly, cold and trembling with ecstasy, as though she were seeing it before her eyes. Sonya has courage and strength and a sense of purpose by the end of the reading. And the reader gets the sense that she's the one who has been unbound, that she's the one who has been changed and received new life just by reading about the one who is the resurrection and the life. It's as though she is given new life in this desperate and despairing and terrifying situation. This part of the audiobook was so moving to listen to because the reader's voice was getting stronger and stronger as the passage progressed, and the transformation that was happening in Sonya was vivid and visceral and was transferred to this hearer just by hearing Sonia's voice get stronger and stronger because of her claiming Christ as Lord, so too the reader, the hearer, experienced that claim of Jesus as the resurrection and the life. This story of the raising of Lazarus in John 11 is located precisely at the center of the Gospel of John. 10 chapters precede it, 10 chapters follow it. One scholar calls it the hinge between Jesus' public ministry and his private ministry to the disciples. It represents a climax to Jesus' earlier actions, it being the ultimate sign, the last in a series of 7 signs in the first 10 chapters in the book of John, and a foreshadowing of Jesus' own death and resurrection. This story contains the heart of the gospel lesson, the revelation that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. It is this information, and it's the action of this gospel of the raising of Lazarus that alerts the authorities that Jesus must die. There is so much going on in this passage that we can't engage it all, lots of richness, and more than we can chew on for today. So I'm going to narrow our focus to verses 44 and 45. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." It's been made clear that Lazarus is dead. There's mention of a stench, and according to popular Jewish belief at the time, the soul hovered around the body in the grave 3 days after death, hoping to re-enter the body. But after the 3rd day, when the soul sees the color of its face has changed, the soul leaves the body for good. Lazarus is dead. No question about it. Contrast that with Jesus, who is the resurrection and the life. And we can visualize the layers of cloth wrapped around Lazarus, mummy-like, and Jesus demanding he be unbound, unwrapped, set free. Lazarus was dead and bound. Contrast that with Jesus, the resurrection and the life, who says, "Unbind him." Lazarus becomes free, unshackled, and is given life once again because of his encounter with the one who is life, the one who is the resurrection and the life. When I was in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, visiting churches there and learning about Christian worship in that cultural context, I learned about the missionaries who planted seeds of faith in that region. The way that the Christian missionaries started schools for the children was by inviting both boys and girls to attend the schools, but the girls weren't allowed to come if their feet were bound. The message the Christian missionaries wanted to make clear was that Jesus unbinds feet and hearts and loosens that which restricts and controls and constricts life, because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Now, there are all kinds of strictures that bind us up, that keep us locked up, that keep us less than free, that we construct for ourselves. Bound feet are just one kind of bondage from the past. What are some strictures that you can think of today that hold us back, that keep us less than free? Another way of phrasing this question is, what needs unbinding in your life and in mine so that you and I can experience Jesus as the resurrection and the life? In what way are you bound so tightly, too tightly, such that you are unable to experience resurrection and life? Some strictures and binding that wrap us up and keep us confined and shackled that come to my mind are addictions to pornography, to alcohol, to our devices, to news, to busyness, to things and acquiring more things, to status, to a great social life, to popularity. What needs unbinding in your life? Where are you bound so tightly that you cannot experience resurrection life? I wonder if resurrection is not something you have to believe, not something just conveniently confessed, not that which can be comprehended. I wonder if resurrection is something that can only be experienced. Because when you experience resurrection, you start to feel resurrected, and that confidence comes into every bone and muscle. Resurrection is not a theory. Resurrection is not some sort of ambiguous promise. Resurrection is relationship with Christ, and resurrection is now and is life. I wonder if resurrection couldn't be an unbinding of what constrains, constricts, holds us back, and keeps us from being less than free today, right now. At the end of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov confesses his crime and is sent to Siberia to serve out his conviction. Sonia goes with him and rents a small apartment near the prison where he is serving his time. And she becomes acquainted with all the prisoners and becomes beloved among them because of her kindness toward them. And slowly but surely, Raskolnikov's guilt, his anger, his self-loathing, and his agitation, they lessen and they loosen. And one day he finds himself with Sonia behind him and is flooded with a feeling of love for her. How it happened, he did not know, but all at once, something seemed to seize him. At first sight, she was frightened, but then she understood, and a light of infinite happiness came to her eyes. She knew he loved her. And Dostoevsky continues, their faces were bright with the dawn of a new future and a full resurrection into new life. He had risen again, and he knew it, and he felt it in all his being. Life stepped into the place of theory, and everything changed. Raskolnikov asked Sonia for a Bible, and she gave him the New Testament from which she had read to him about the raising of Lazarus so many years ago. His joy was euphoric. He was set free. He still had 7 years to serve in the prison, and he was still in Siberia, but he was unbound. And he knew the one who is the resurrection and the life. The one who says, I am the resurrection and the life, also says, I am the bread of life. I am the true vine. And as we gather at this table and take the bread and the fruit of the vine, we move from theory to experiencing the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. As you take the bread and the cup today, think about what needs unbinding in your life. and then go out to experience resurrection from the one who is the host at this table and is the resurrection and the life. Thanks be to God.